Hey guys, Rachel here from the Confused Millennial, and today we are going to be doing a DIY phases of the moon wall hanging. So basically I had this awkward space between my mirror and sliding door. I'm in the process of making this room my daughter's playroom. You may have seen me redo the fireplace last year. Stay tuned because there's a lot of cool projects we're working on in this room. But I wanted to get this space filled, and it's kind of an awkward width. It's definitely long, and I couldn't find anything that would fit there. I knew I wanted to make something, and we loved this kind of brassy metal wall hanging that was already in my daughter's room. Obviously, I love the moon. My daughter is named after the moon. We have moon wallpaper. It's everywhere. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of bring that through thread into this room as well. And if you don't know what I mean by through thread, I have an entire blog post and YouTube video that I'll link in the description below, all about how to create a mood board for your entire home, which is really helpful when you're starting from scratch like we basically were. Screenshot this. These are gonna be all your supplies that you need. If you miss any, they're all written out in the blog post. So step one is going to be measuring the width and length that you want your wall hanging. Again, mine was pretty wide, and I had a little bit of a hard time finding a sheet metal that would actually go this wide. So I linked a really thin sheet metal from Amazon below. That one would have been the ideal one to use because it's much thinner and a lot easier to cut. I unfortunately had to go with more of like a moderately thick one, so it ended up swapping out which cutting pliers I needed to use for this. So definitely make sure before you buy your sheet metal, you know your width, and you also know how thick the sheet metal is, because it could mean using a different set of cutting pliers. These are the smaller ones that work well with the thin sheet metal. These are the heavy duty ones that I ended up needing to use. So one thing I'll note is that when you're cutting metal, it's challenging no matter what. And then when you're cutting it into circles, it's challenging also. My heavy duty ones were flat, flush, so straight lines. These thinner ones here are curved. I really wish I would have had my heavy duty ones curved, because it did make it even harder to go around with those really sharp straight edges, which is why I left the base of my moons kind of flush and straight lines. By the time I got there, I was just like, you know what? I don't need this to be super spherical, half moony. At the end of the day though, it does just take a little bit of patience, which is something that I don't have a whole lot of, so I moved quicker. The slower you can move, the more polished and finished yours will ultimately come out. I just wanted to get it done. I didn't really care about the jagged, sharper, flatter edges. So it's really a personal preference and how much patience you have. So once you have your width measured, how long you want it to be measured, your thickness and size of sheet metal chosen, which cutting pliers you plan to use chosen, it gets down into actually assembling and creating your wall hanging. The first step is going to be tracing your circles. You can use this by doing everyday household items, depending on how big you want your moons to be. You could use a mason jar lid, you could use a bowl, you could use even a masking tape or painter's tape to give you that circle shape. Here, I'm actually using one of my daughter's toys. If you guys have watched my Love Every reviews, they also come in handy for DIY crafts. So, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you have a toddler or baby, I will leave a link in the description box below, because they are an awesome toy subscription service. But back to the DIY. So for tracing your circles onto your sheet metal, I suggest either using a chalk pen, I got this one from the Dollar Tree, or a dry erase marker, so that way you can easily wipe any residue off of the household item you used, if any gets on there, or wipe it off your sheet metal later on. This is another opportunity to customize this piece for your space. I went with 5 phases of the moon. You could go with 7 or 9 if you wanted yours to be longer, or you can make it smaller and drop it down to 3. It's totally up to you. Next step is going to be cutting out your phases of the moon. Again, Patience is your friend here. If you can, make sure you're using a pair of curved cutting pliers. I'm using flush straight ones, which definitely made this a little bit harder, but these were the heavy duty ones I already had on hand. And just go slow, be careful. Some of the edges can get a little sharp, so if you want to wear safety gloves, definitely do that. I felt fine without them, but your hands do get pretty gnarly through the handling of the sheet metal and then handling of the chain later on. And as always, it's good to wear safety goggles. The next step is going to be sanding your phases of the moon that you just cut out. Definitely use a high quality sandpaper. Do not go to the Dollar Tree and get their sandpaper, because even with a high quality sandpaper, a lot of the grit comes off the paper and just gets everywhere. I also, aside from sanding out the edges of my moon to make them a little bit smoother, getting rid of any jagged parts, I also scuffed up the faces a little bit. If you don't want to scuff up your faces, just make sure that you are being really careful and patient, once again, when doing your edges. Otherwise, you may accidentally scratch the faces of your moon, and then you may have to scuff up the faces just to make it look like you didn't make a mistake. But it's totally a personal preference. I like the scuffed up, worn look. So now that our moons are cut, they're sanded down, we want to prep them for assembly. So we're gonna get our metal hole puncher, and we're gonna go as close to the edge as possible and just poke a hole. It can be really helpful to lay out how your wall hanging will ultimately look, so what the finished product will look like, to make sure you're putting the holes in the right spots. Depending if you're doing this vertically or horizontally, your holes may be on different sides of your wall hanging. Like I said, this is totally custom. I made a vertical one, but you could also do this horizontal, like this one here in my daughter's nursery. So the horizontal one or landscape one is definitely going to be a bit easier. All you're gonna do is measure out the length of your chain where you would hang it on the wall, and then you'll measure out how little pieces for how far you would want your phases of the moon to drop down below it. Now, if you're going vertical, it gets a little bit trickier, and this is where you're going to refer to your original measurement. See how long you wanted your wall hanging to be, and then subtract the length of each of your phases of the moon. When you get that finished number, you're going to divide that by how many chains you'll ultimately need. So one at the top, one at the bottom, and then depending on how many phases of the moon you created for yours, one for in between each of those. So I had 5 phases of the moon. I needed 4 in between pieces, and then 1 on top, 1 on the bottom. I took that number and divided it by 6, then got to cutting my chain. Now it is time to assemble your phases of the moon. You're going to start by taking your jump ring and your long nose pliers, open up the jump ring, slide it through the hole of your moon phases, and then slide one of the chains onto that same jump ring, and then just take your long nose pliers to close that back up, and repeat this until all of the phases of the moons are attached with a jump ring to the chain, and so on. Be securing the top of your wall hanging. And you can do this really simply. If you had done a horizontal one, you could simply use jump rings at either end. And if you are using a thin piece of sheet metal and it's not too heavy, that may be all you need. Mine's kind of heavy, so I didn't trust just a jump ring at the top of it. So what I did was I took a jump ring, attached it to the top of my actual wall hanging, and then I cut a small piece of chain and just created a loop with that. You could also just get some wire if you're using that in the next step, and just kind of create a loop that way. If you want to personalize your wall hanging and add a little bit of style to it, you could go ahead and get some wire and some beads or feathers or whatever you have on hand. I had these wooden beads from the dollar store, and I just went ahead and painted them gold with some paint I already had at home, looped them through the wire as you guys can see here, and then secured that to the tail end of my wall hanging to give it a more finished look. Another little trick I find that works really well is using bracelets, you know, all those beaded bracelets and all those stacks. I find that if you take those, cut the beads off the bracelet, you can get some really beautiful beads that are typically nicer than what you might find at a craft store and are pretty well priced compared to some of the ones that you would find at a craft store. make sure to hit that notification and subscribe button because I have loads more DIYs in the pipeline. Like I said, this is going to be part of a larger room that I am working on. It's been in the works for a year. We already did our fireplace in here. We got the wall hanging done. I have a really fun custom paint job going up, and we are going to be converting this sitting room into a functional playroom, homeschool room for a toddler, so take that with a grain of salt. And so we have a lot of really fun stuff I'm working on for this space, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. In the meantime, feel free to catch up on our fireplace makeover. I'll leave a link in the description box below for how to create a mood board for your entire home when you're starting from scratch, and also for that toddler toy subscription service I mentioned earlier as well. And I'd love to see if you guys make this, how it ended up coming out. If you guys have any questions about this, feel free to hit me up on Instagram at @theconfusedmillennial. And until next time, I'm Rachel.